Well, welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle podcast. I am, as usual, Jodelle, and let's give 3 hip hip hoorays because Georgi Dinkov is back with us today talking all things cortisol and improving our stress response and our health in general. Georgi is the founder of Idea Labs, a company that I greatly recommend and use myself and also recommend to all of my clients. So if you have not tried them, I highly encourage that. And Georgi, I wanted to ask you specifically, you're working on a couple of self-funded studies that I wanted you to just tell my listeners about just briefly before we get started talking about cortisol and stress. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. One of them is actually related to one of the products that we're going to discuss, the Cortisol. As you, I'm sure, you probably have seen, the metabolic therapy gives special attention to certain steroids. They call the steroids of youth. This is pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA. And specifically progesterone and DHEA separately, when used separately, there's a ton of studies on them, with them, mostly in animals, showing profound anti-cancer, anti-diabetic, anti-inflammatory, anti-aging effect, and we're going to talk a little bit about anti-aging later. But I have not been able to find any study that actually uses a combination of these two steroids. Okay. And then just by looking at maybe at least 200 or 300 studies using separately these steroids separately, I basically was able to come up with a ratio that seemed that I conjectured would be optimal for improving health, and would have potent effect on the redox status, shifting it from reduction towards oxidation, which is another way of saying increasing metabolism, right? So I found, basically, I've always wanted to do my own studies because, reading studies on PubMed is fine as a first step, but of course you're relying on other people's information, on other people's evidence. And invariably, even if you don't suspect people of being dishonest, and most of them are honest, there are unique requirements for each study, depending on the environment, depending on funding, the way the animals are treated, the way the compound was administered, the preparation of the compound. Was it dissolved in alcohol? Was it given by mouth? Was it given by injection? So basically, all of these studies, they have converging results, but not entirely overlapping. So I wanted to say, okay, so let's use Dr. Pete's formulation, which is dissolving the progesterone and DHEA in vitamin E, and then basically let's administer it orally, and then let's use the doses that individually were shown to be very potently pro-metabolic, but let's use a combination of progesterone and DHEA. So I basically started looking for labs or for companies in general that provide these animal testing services. And there are quite a few of them because that's how pharmaceutical companies work. If you're a big pharmaceutical company like Pfizer, you probably have all of these resources already in-house, from start to finish, what they call from benchmark to bed, which means from some chemist sitting at Pfizer coming up with an idea for a new chemical, all the way down to running a clinical trial. Pfizer, being a massive pharmaceutical company, has this whole cycle fully in-house, right? But smaller companies, including tiny companies like me, we can't do this in-house, so we basically have to look for companies that provide this as a service. And there are quite a few of them because most companies out there, whether pharmaceutical or chemical or any company that deals with vitamins and supplements, they're smaller in size, so they have to rely on these third-party companies. So I contacted maybe, I would say 20 to 30 of them, and I said, hey, I have this formulation, which we call Cortisol, as you know. Would you be able to do a animal trial with it and see what, let's test its anti-cancer effects. And the reason I chose cancer is because typically, first of all, the recent statistics show that cancer overtook cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death in the United States. Yeah. And actually all Western countries, not just the United States, but UK and most of Europe. And the projection is that if the current trends continue, within a decade, cancer will be the leading cause of death in the entire world. Right now, cancer is the leading cause of death in the Western developed world, and then infectious disease is the leading cause of death in the third world countries. But if current trends continue, cancer will become the leading cause of that worldwide. So I said, okay, so the statistics says that the lifetime risk of a person contracting any kind of a cancer, getting any kind of a cancer, is in excess of 50%. So in other words, more than 1 in 2 people throughout their lifetime, unfortunately, it looks like they're going to have to be dealing with cancer at some point. So clearly, cancer is a huge burden, emotional, financial, health-wise, destroys families. I probably don't need to do any, I mean, all of this is pretty obvious. So I said, okay, let's try cancer. And because cancer is considered such a difficult disease to treat in mainstream circles, anything that shows an even remotely positive effect on cancer is assumed to be that much more dramatically beneficial for healthy people or for people with less serious conditions. So I said, okay, if we can make some inroads in cancer using progesterone and DHEA, then, you know, even if it doesn't, you know, fully cure it, this would automatically mean that actually there are even formulas which say if your chemical is, let's say, 20% effective against cancer, if it increases survival by 20%, that automatically means that that basically will be 80% effective in remediating diabetes type 2, or 90% effective in remediating cardiovascular disease, because they're all pretty much the same disease. I mean, as by now we know, the metabolic theory says that everything comes to deficiency of energy, right? That's what it comes down to. It's just various levels of energetic dysfunction, with cancer probably being the most egregious abnormal state, and then there are various other levels, lower levels of pathology. So anyways, long story short, I found a lab that said, okay, we'll do it, and they're testing right now cortisol on a highly lethal of cancer induced by a virus in mice. Okay. And basically, this cancer is so lethal that if you can increase the survival of the animals that have been given the tumor by even 10%, that's already blockbuster news. You will get published in any journal you want as long as the data is legitimate, right? Well, I mean, preliminary results are already in, and it looks like the group that got the cortisol and then got inoculated with a tumor is basically, it looks like it will completely survive it. So wow. That's something that, you know, the primary investigator, the one who runs the lab, he said, I've never seen anything like this. And then they have various parameters through which they test how healthy the animals are. That's another crazy result. The group that got the cortisol and then got inoculated with a virus, their biomarkers look better than the healthy group that never got the tumor at all. So we'll see. I mean, it's too early to say. There's some very promising results. And long story short, I wanted to start doing my own studies, right? And in the second study, just so that I can, you know, you rely on other people's evidence is fine. The problem is, like I said, it's biased. Sometimes it's fraudulent, and ultimately, the ultimate source of knowledge is experiment. So if you really want to increase your knowledge, at some point you'll have to start experimenting. It doesn't have to be studies. Sitting at home and experimenting with supplements is another way. You know, experimenting with different dietary interventions is another way. So the second study that I also I'm about to start, it uses the steroid dihydrotestosterone will try to treat prostate cancer with it, again in animals. And the reason I started this study is that there's the current mainstream medical version of what causes prostate cancer is precisely that steroid. They have this bizarre idea that men develop prostate cancer because their androgens are too high. Yet, if you look at the men who have prostate cancer, they look anything but like men with high androgen. Many of them are obese and or overweight. Their bones are crumbling. Basically, like the skin on their face is sagging. They have heart problems. They have high blood pressure. Many of them have diabetes, and they hardly look like the high androgen phenotype, which is that, you know, chiseled jaw, you know, a ripped look that, you know, many people associate with I don't know, a young surfer, you know, going on vacation and, you know, to Hawaii. Yeah. So right from the beginning, this theory actually started in the early 20th century. As soon as people came up with it, there was an immediate backlash, and a good portion of the medical community said, you people are insane. I mean, if androgens were the cause of prostate cancer, then we would have had 20-year-old men coming down with this disease all the time. So something here does not add up. Why? Because it's the men in their 20s that have the highest level of androgens that they will ever be in their lifetime. And after that, it's just downhill from there. I mean, it's a very well-known phenomenon that androgen production in men declines with age. So for one reason or another, the people who promoted the theory that androgens cause prostate cancer, quote unquote, won. So that was the dominant theory. It continues to be the dominant theory up until this day, even though quite a few holes have been poked in it. But to this day, if you, God forbid, develop prostate cancer and you go to your doctor, the therapy you will get as a male is essentially what they call chemical castration. So it's only slightly, I guess, only slightly worse than the therapy that was used to be given up until the 70s, which was basically physical castration. It's really these barbaric therapies that many men find that, in a weird way, some people wish that they died, but they kept their vitality, virility, masculinity, and quality of life. And ironically, most men who undergo the castration, chemical or physical, the cancer comes back and turns into something called, doctors call castration-resistant prostate cancer. So then these men are given estrogen therapy. So these men start growing breasts.
Oh my gosh.
These men start getting high-pitched voices. Essentially, these men turn into women. And even that doesn't seem to be stopping the cancer. So a few studies over the last maybe 5 years found out that giving the strongest androgen in the male body is dihydrotestosterone. So a few studies over the last 5 years found that if you give dihydrotestosterone, if you take dihydrotestosterone and add it to the current existing regimen of therapies that men are given, for prostate cancer, all these studies were in animals, by the way, then the cancer actually stops. But then mainstream medicine immediately came back and said, yeah, but you weren't treating only with the androgen. You were giving the androgen in combination with an already established drug. So in all likelihood, it's the established drug that's doing the cure, and maybe the androgen is simply helping. But this already is opening Pandora's box, because it raises serious questions whether the original theory is even correct. If anything, if you're giving the androgen that is thought to be the cause of prostate cancer and combining with a treatment, you should weaken it, not strengthen it, right? That is what you would expect. Yet the exact opposite happens. And then over the last 2 years, I think I've sent you the links before, but I can send them to you again later. The popular press came up with these news articles, and they were called Cancer Paradox. Testosterone stops lethal prostate cancer in humans. So in their desperation to find a treatment, any kind of treatment that works for advanced prostate cancer, some doctor, two doctors actually, one in Johns Hopkins University, and I think the other one is at Columbia University in New York. They basically took testosterone, put it in an injection, and then injected it directly into the prostates of their cancer patients. And every single one of them went into a remission. Not only they went into a remission, but the metastasis, the spread of the cancer, which at this point, all these men had stage 4 prostate cancer, which is the last stage. And when it spreads to the bone, to the liver, to the brain, it's more or less considered terminal. So these people were on their way out, essentially. And then in every single one, I think it was just 6 or 7 people in one of the studies and 4 in the other. So these are very small studies. In every single case, these men recovered. Not only do they recover, their cancer disappeared. So immediately, this should have been treated as evidence that the whole theory that androgens are causing prostate cancer is bunk. It's actually it looks like quite the opposite, that androgens are treating the prostate cancer. Well, mainstream medicine came up with another explanation. And you see, when you inject testosterone into these men, they were converting it into estrogen, and it was estrogen that was therapeutic. So So I decided to end this once and for all. So I decided to do an animal study with an androgen that cannot be converted into estrogen. So if we and we'll use only that steroid. There'll be no other treatment. There will be a group that gets standard treatment, which is whatever toxic chemotherapy they use currently. Then there will be a second group that gets only the steroid, this strong androgen called DHT, and then there will be a control group which gets nothing. So we'll see which group does the best. If the group treated with the androgen, which is what I expect will do the best, then it's essentially over. I mean, I don't know how exactly we'll get this published. I suspect many journals will refuse to publish it. But if the data is solid, sooner or later, we'll find a journal that will be willing to publish it. And then it's possible that it will be all over the news. So that's really what I'm doing. I mean, one of the tests is simply to show that progesterone and DHEA have effects in humans, because so far not many studies have been done. They've been done with separately with progesterone and DHEA, but all of the anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-diabetic, anti-heart disease, all of the strong evidence available for these steroids so far comes from animal trials. And big pharma and the medical industry is saying we can't treat people with progesterone and DHEA because we don't have first, we don't have any studies that show the combination treatment. And second, we don't have any studies that show the combination treatment in humans. So I'll do the first step. I'll do the study will be the combination of DHEA and progesterone, in hamsters for a highly lethal disease. And then if that succeeds, there'll be a follow-up study with humans, which I'm already working on. And hopefully we'll be able to show benefit in humans as well. And the second study, it's basically, I would say it's entirely, what should I call it? Both of them I would like to consider them altruistic, but the second one is quite obviously something that I stand nothing to gain from because I don't sell dihydrotestosterone. I don't have a product like that. This is done strictly to enhance knowledge and to hopefully destroy a fraudulent, in my opinion, theory that has resulted in the unnecessary castration and frankly, early death of tens of millions of men over the last 100 years. That's how long it has been in use. So so those are the studies that I'm currently working on.
That is fantastic. Even I've lost an uncle to prostate cancer. So hearing you talk about this and hearing you say how you don't really stand to benefit from this, you're always about that, though. You're always about knowledge and giving people, true information. And your bottom line isn't this lucrative business of like selling supplements. And that's why I always have you on the podcast. And I love your philosophy because it's about helping people understand the true nature of health and how to enhance their body naturally. And so I really appreciate that you're self-funding this and that you're doing good with this, with the income that you're making off of your supplements too. You're actually like paying it forward and making good with it. So I love that. Like, I just really commend you for that.
Thank
and
you.
I'm assuming that now as we jump into the podcast, I'm assuming that the mechanism behind like the Cortisol being one of your studies is that even with cancer, lowering cortisol is really important because any sort of disease, 95%, I think they say, of all diseases stem from some sort of stress response in the body. So let's talk about like the adrenals and how important those are, since that's where cortisol kind of comes from. Do you want to start there? Should we start there?
Sure. So I think you wouldn't be a surprise to most of your listeners when I say that the so-called hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA, is dysregulated when people are under chronic stress. This is widely known. Most doctors don't deny it. Even children in high school study that this is the actual stress response, right? You perceive a threat, you perceive something that requires you to muster up a response, and then as a result, your brain sends signals to your pituitary gland sends another signal to your adrenals, and then they start pumping out cortisol and adrenaline. And as we discussed in previous podcasts, the point of these stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, is to supply the cells in your body with extra fuel. And where they get this fuel from is cortisol essentially starts to melt many of your tissues, mostly muscles, but muscles, skin, brain, liver, spleen, pretty much anything that consists of amino acid will be a target for cortisol, and adrenaline starts shedding your fatty tissue. So the goal basically is to help you get over the stress, right? To overcome whatever obstacle you're facing, and then survive and move on. Now this actually has a very good reason. This mechanism has a very good reason for existing from an evolutionary perspective, where most of the stresses that our ancestors experienced were brief, intense, but then they went away. Right. Let's say you're chasing an antelope in the savannah, you're hunting, but within an hour or two, the hunt is over, and hopefully you got what you needed, and that's it. If a predator is chasing you, chances are you will not be engaged in a marathon for 26 miles. The predator either catches you pretty quickly, or you escape, and then again it's over. Right. So this basically acute stress response has been shown to be perfectly normal and physiological, and the release of cortisol and adrenaline for brief periods of time has been shown to not be highly detrimental. But guess what? Our modern lifestyle has resulted in us living in a situation which resembles being chased by a saber-toothed tiger almost 24/7. Right. Whether that's working hours that are too long, whether that's basically worrying how you're going to support your family. Many people these days are either single breadwinner families or single parent families. There's many times a person has to support not only their children, but also their aging parents, sick relatives, etc., etc. They have to pay mortgages. All of these things contribute to a state called chronic low-grade stress. And actually, at this point, I wouldn't even call it low-grade. I mean, it's a pretty robust stress, which continues for as long as we're awake. And then, I guess it would still have been that bad if we were actually able to sleep deeply and properly and recover. But we don't, because this chronic overactivation of the HPA axis results in a chronically elevated cortisol. And while cortisol and adrenaline are elevated, we cannot properly sleep. We cannot properly rest. We don't go through the full cycle of sleep, which includes the deep restorative sleep. We only get into the first cycle of sleep, which is this shallow sleep, which is akin to what wild animals get. That's how zebras sleep in the wild, because they're afraid that at any point in time a lion will show up and we eat them. Lions are nocturnal; they hunt at night for that very reason. So it's almost like the zebras in the savannah. We don't get to rest even at night. So this cycle, this vicious cycle with intense stress during the day and a probably slightly less intense but still ongoing stress during the night, starts to wreak absolute havoc on our bodies and on our health in general. Unfortunately, the mainstream medical theory about the stress response says that it only causes problems in people who are genetically susceptible. Yet they have never been able to identify a gene or a group of genes that is responsible for conferring this genetic vulnerability. They say, well, during traumatic events, only 10% of the people who experience traumatic events go on to develop chronic health conditions. But when these studies were done either during or shortly after the Second World War. So most of our data comes from these old studies where people didn't know exactly what to measure and how to define whether somebody developed a chronic disease later on. They mostly tested for, I think they looked at heart attacks and strokes, right? But they didn't look at cancer. They didn't look at Alzheimer's disease. They didn't look at diabetes, because at that time it was considered completely unrelated that stress will cause any of these conditions. So these weren't even measured. Yet we continue to hear that, don't worry, stress is not bad for you. Maybe for about 10% of you, it may be bad, but for the vast majority of people, it's harmless. In fact, we're getting blasted with these propaganda statements that actually stress is good for you. It causes the so-called hormetic response. In other words, almost like the ancient Rome, when rich patricians were afraid somebody's going to poison them. So in order to prevent that, they were actually ingesting small dosages of poison on a daily basis, and that's why they developed resistance. And many of them actually survived assassination attempts with poison because they were prepared. So that's where the word hormesis really comes from, that small doses of the poison, of the stressor, makes you more resilient to the stressor, to a large amount of stress or a poison.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, this has never been shown to work with stress, only with poison. Second of all, we don't get to experience the hormetic effect because, unlike the patricians who truly ingested small amounts of poison, we're under a massive amount of stress all the time. So we don't even, we've never been in a situation where we, under controlled circumstances, we exposed ourselves to a little bit of stress so we could build up our resistance, if the hormetic theory even works. It never worked that way. We were basically thrown directly into the pit, and basically we started living with stress, and we continue to live with stress almost 24/7. So the metabolic theory, on the other hand, of health says that stress is actually the primary cause, if not the cause, of most health problems that people experience. And it's not just chronic conditions. Actually, infectious disease, in order for it to take a hold in the body, requires a suppressed immune system. And it just so happens that cortisol is the most potent endogenous immunosuppressant, maybe together with serotonin. But cortisol is known. If you go to a doctor, let's say you break a leg, or you have a rash, or you have any other condition that is considered an inflammatory reaction. If it's severe enough, the doctor will either give you oral cortisol or cortisol by injection. But they will always warn you. They'll ask you to sign a disclaimer which says, I hereby sign that I understand that by getting cortisol, I am exposing myself to potentially lethal infections that I would normally otherwise wouldn't be vulnerable to. So this is standard practice, right? Medicine doesn't deny that cortisol destroys the immune system. Well, recent evidence has shown that lack of proper immune response is actually behind a number of different really severe and potentially lethal conditions, especially cancers like melanoma, or actually, believe it or not, cardiovascular disease. Who would have thought that the immune system and cardiovascular disease would go hand in hand? Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. So a number of different diseases, many of them affecting a large number of people, many of them, actually most of them considered untreatable, now turn out to be linked to suppressed immune response. And cortisol is the main driver of that process. Adrenaline doesn't help much either. Adrenaline elevates the levels of free fatty acids in the blood, and these free fatty acids, if they're actually of the PUFA variety, they're precursors to inflammatory mediators such as the prostaglandins, the leukotrienes, the thromboxanes. These free fatty acids promote the synthesis of nitric oxide, promote the synthesis of serotonin, promote the synthesis of cortisol. So this is all becomes a vicious circle of releasing immunosuppressive hormones into the blood, while at the same time dramatically increasing the inflammatory burden. Both of these things, low immune response and chronic low-grade inflammation, are now known to be one of the causes, if not the cause, of almost every chronic serious condition that we are aware of. And basically, that's what the stress response gets you to be in this constant state of inflammation and immunosuppression. And just both cortisol and adrenaline increase the synthesis of estrogen, increase the synthesis of prolactin. They suppress the synthesis of the protective steroids such as progesterone, DHEA, and pregnenolone. And speaking of protective steroids, why are they protective? Well, it just so happens that progesterone, pregnenolone, and DHEA are the most potent endogenous blockers of cortisol. In fact, progesterone is capable of directly blocking the cortisol effect on the cortisol receptor, which is considered a classical cortisol antagonist effect, right? DHEA is capable of inhibiting the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol, while at the same time it increases the activity of the enzyme that degrades cortisol. So while DHEA itself doesn't necessarily have a direct, structurally opposing effect to cortisol at the receptor in the cell, it has a functionally anti-cortisol effect because it simply prevents the synthesis of too much cortisol, right? And that also has an anti-cortisol effect. Pregnenolone has similar effects to both DHEA and progesterone. So basically, I thought that, okay, by the way, both progesterone, DHEA, all three are actually potent anti-inflammatory steroids as well.
Mm-hmm.
So just by looking at all of these studies, I realized that if immunosuppression, which is largely driven by cortisol, and the inflammatory reaction, the chronic inflammatory reaction, are the main causes of pretty much every chronic disease out there, then steroids or other chemicals that oppose these two pathological states should be highly therapeutic, should be highly beneficial. Well, progesterone and DHEA. We have one product with that, we're calling it Cortinone, simply because the most well-known effects of progesterone and DHEA are precisely the opposition to cortisol. We also have a pregnenolone product, but long story short, I said, let's start with one, let's test it, let's see what it does, and let's confirm some of these pieces of evidence that have been accumulating over a long period of time, but nobody has really so far put it together. There is no interest in the pharmaceutical industry of working with progesterone and DHEA. Both of these are over the counter. Both of these are unpatentable. Both of these are, I don't want to say dirt cheap, but they're much cheaper than any pharmaceutical drug that you can get. So that was my idea. Take these two steroids associated with youth, with health, with general well-being, with longevity, and let's test them on some really severe, potentially lethal diseases, and see if we can either reverse, stop, or at the very least greatly retard the progression of these diseases. Any of these outcomes would be great, because remember, modern medicine for the vast majority of these conditions will simply tell you, there's nothing we can do for you. This is incurable. We will simply manage you. We'll manage your symptoms, and you're in God's hands. Let's see what happens. So I said, let's take it a step further and hopefully show that there's nothing that is irreversible.
Wow, that's so cool that we're able to get those results already. You're already kind of seeing those preliminary results coming in, and it doesn't really surprise me, because any experience I've had with progesterone or DHEA, you can actually feel the effects happening in your body of kind of a de-stressing mechanism. And in my practice, I do see a lot of poor adrenal health, and it's like a trickle-down effect. It affects so many different things. So I wanted to discuss the relationship of some different aspects, like cortisol and the thyroid, cortisol and weight gain, cortisol and estrogen dominance. Can you touch on some of these?
So yeah, cortisol has two main functions. One of them is to oppose inflammation, right? And the second one is to keep blood glucose elevated enough so that your brain gets sufficient fuel. Mm-hmm. If your brain doesn't get enough glucose, you can go into the so-called hypoglycemic coma, which is very common among diabetics, right? So the main point of cortisol is to keep your brain alive, and the second one is to keep inflammation down. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the way it achieves this is, because it's an emergency situation, it achieves that at the cost of destroying everything else that is considered non-essential.
Right.
And if you're trying to survive and running away from a predator, guess what? Nature decided that your thyroid is not essential. Mm-hmm. Nature decides that being lean, muscular, and good-looking is not essential. You're trying to survive. You'll worry about your beach body later, right?
Right. Yeah.
And again, like I said, if this is like a brief, intense situation every once in a while, then it's really not that big of a problem. I mean, nature created us to be able to withstand these occasional, periodic, but brief, incursions of stress. What nature did not intend for us to do is to be constantly on the defensive against a threat, real or perceived. So just as you mentioned, as a side effect, because your thyroid gland is also composed of amino acids, and I already mentioned previously that cortisol will basically generate, will flood the bloodstream with amino acids, because the liver takes those and converts them to glucose. Mm-hmm. So cortisol supplies the raw material for the liver to produce glucose. And then anything composed of amino acids, cortisol will be highly detrimental for. Thyroid is one such gland. If that wasn't bad enough, cortisol is actually capable of directly blocking the thyroid receptor. So even if you produce enough thyroid, if your cortisol levels are high enough, cortisol will actually prevent the thyroid from getting into the cell where it's supposed to get and doing its good. So cortisol is considered almost a direct thyroid antagonist. And if that wasn't enough, cortisol actually increases the synthesis of fat and its deposition in the liver. Because you brought this topic up, it reminds me of a study that just came out today. I'm about to post on my blog and the forum, which showed that diabetes type 2 is actually entirely a liver disease, and it's driven by elevated cortisol. Now, medicine knows that cortisol increases the synthesis of fat and increases the deposition of that fat around the midsection. Mainstream medicine also knows that cortisol is detrimental for the thyroid, detrimental for the brain. It's a known cause of depression. About 3/4 of people with severe depression have elevated cortisol levels. Mm-hmm. So it's a known cause of thymus atrophy of the thymus gland. So all of these things are known, but like I said, nobody seems to be putting them together. Each one of these groups works on its own in isolation and doesn't really share results with us. They just throw them and publish them out there. But again, in order for somebody to be putting things together, there has to be some kind of an interest. And unfortunately, in our modern days, this means commercial interest. Since there's no commercial interest in exposing the evils of cortisol, because cortisol is actually a clinically used drug, it makes money for its manufacturers. Mm-hmm. This means that unless somebody out there, whether it's me or somebody else who decides to do this out of pure interest, in other words, not financial interest, but just because of curiosity, then it's likely that this knowledge will never be synthesized. It is still out there. All of this is published data. I can provide the evidence, but there is no study that ties these things together and says, until yesterday, which says, oh my God, what we've been calling diabetes type 2 is actually a misnomer. It's not diabetes type 2. It has nothing to do with diabetes. It is simply chronic hypercortisolemia, which leads, and they even list the stages. The first stage you get is you start to basically start depositing fat around the midsection. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of people with diabetes type 2 are overweight or obese. Yeah. And they have the so-called central obesity, which is most of the fat is around the core, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have that much fat on their extremities.
Right.
And then the study showed that this is one of the earliest stages, one of the earliest signs/symptoms of elevated cortisol. And then little by little, what happens is that cortisol starts to fatten up the liver, and then it also downregulates, desensitizes the cortisol receptors inside the liver. So over time, this basically creates a signal for the body which says, well, the liver always needs to be in a situation where the liver should be capable of producing glucose, right? Cortisol is the signal for the liver to produce glucose. But if the liver has become desensitized to cortisol because cortisol has been staying elevated for so long, guess what? The body will keep increasing, and more, and more, and more. And there's no end to this for as long as your adrenals are able to keep up. Mm-hmm. You will keep producing more cortisol because the liver is becoming desensitized. And that cortisol will create not only more desensitization of the liver cortisol receptor, but it will also fatten up the liver, and it will fatten up the rest of you. Mm-hmm. Until you get to a point where basically the liver essentially becomes so insensitive to the cortisol, to the effects of cortisol, to the lack or excess of cortisol, the liver essentially says, you know what, screw that. I will start producing glucose no matter what, whether there's cortisol or not, simply because I cannot trust this mechanism anymore. It is useless to me because typically in a healthy person, me being the liver, I'll basically say, okay, every once in a while, I will see cortisol in the bloodstream, which tells me a person is under stress, and I'll start producing glucose. But if this condition never ends, the liver essentially, I don't mean to make it sound like the liver is somehow sentient, it has its own consciousness, but the liver, the way the structure of the liver changes is to essentially start producing glucose by default, whether you need it or not. And that's what we're seeing in diabetes type 2. People with diabetes type 2 have chronically elevated blood glucose, and doctors simply don't know why. Well, now the study says that it's the elevated cortisol that has stayed elevated for too long, to the point where it's essentially turned that negative feedback mechanism that exists in the liver, has turned it off. And now the only way to turn it back on is actually administer chemicals that block the effects of cortisol. Progesterone, DHEA, pregnenolone. There's some commercial drugs such as RU486. This is the infamous abortion pill, but many people don't know that it only started getting marketed as an abortion pill around the 60s when the feminism movement was picking up. The original design of RU486 was as a glucocorticoid receptor antagonist. In other words, as a blocker of cortisol's effects. Long story short, once your liver is in a situation where it is resistant to the signaling of cortisol, the only way to make it sensitive again is to administer chemicals that basically block the receptor, and that makes the liver, it basically tells the liver the stress has stopped. And then the liver says, okay, now it's time to recover. So there have been clinical trials with humans administering this cortisol blocker called RU486, and have shown dramatic, almost within 2 weeks, people with severe type 2 diabetes are back to normal. That's how quickly it happens. Yeah. And I can send you, there are several officially registered clinical trials with humans on clinicaltrials.gov, and you'll see the evidence is out there. But like I said, big pharma is after money, like many, if not all large commercial companies out there. So, if you want, you can use RU486, but it has a number of side effects, like most commercially developed drugs. Why not use something that is natural, that your own body produces and your own body uses to offset all of these detrimental effects of cortisol? Well, pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA are 3 such agents, and that was kind of the driving force behind developing Cortisol, because since I know that cortisol is such a detrimental, potent force in the organism, I thought that there would be a good use of a product that can actually block the excessive effects of cortisol. So that's how Cortisol came to be, and now additional information is available that it may have benefit beyond blocking cortisol, the anti-inflammation, anti-cancer. And speaking of anti-aging, 2 weeks ago, there was a human study, results of a human study were published, and they showed that it was possible to reverse the biological aging in humans by about 7 years. So, and the way they did that was they administered DHEA and 2 other things, human growth hormone and the anti-diabetes drug metformin. But the way the study, if you read the actual study, they are not sure which one of these 3 actually provided the anti-aging effects. And as I explained in one of my posts, the likelihood is that it's the DHEA that is the anti-aging ingredient, because we have so much data from animal trials, because there's already human data which shows the DHEA blocks the effects of cortisol on the thymus and allows the thymus gland to recover. And apparently, just as this study showed and I mentioned earlier, since the thymus gland is one of the primary controllers of your endogenous immune system, by restoring the thymus gland, which tends to atrophy with aging, by restoring the thymus gland, you restore your immunity to a youthful level. And this is apparently enough to cause a widespread rejuvenating effect. And they actually took samples, they took biopsy samples, they measured blood biomarkers, and these people, by all of these parameters, were about 7 years younger than they were before the study started. So long story short, it may very well be possible to fully reverse human aging. And by the way, this has already been shown in animals in a much more dramatic fashion. There are individual studies with DHEA and progesterone showing life extension of up to 40%. But so far, we've always been told this is animals. Nobody's interested in these chemicals because they're cheap and unpatented. Well, now we're seeing some interest, and I think people are finally starting to realize there may be these highly therapeutic substances out there that are cheap, widely available, and we've been neglecting them simply because our health system is ruled by commercial interests.
Okay, I love that. Like the whole anti-aging, like 7 years. I mean, to get back 7 years, that's huge. And I think like what I wanted to go back to was maybe it's not so much insulin resistance as it is cortisol resistant, is what it sounds like that study's saying. And so I want to touch on the fact that I don't think people realize that it's not just about the stress in your life of like your job or your family or whatever. Because I have people that go, no, I'm not stressed. And I said that pays no bearing anymore on our environment, because when you're sitting in Wi-Fi, your body is stressed. When you're sitting under blue light, your body is stressed. When you're sitting around all these different electronic stimulatory devices, your body is stressed. And so it's not just about like, how's your marriage, how's your family, how's your kids, or being a caregiver or whatever. We are bombarded with chronic, like you said, stress that does not stop. Even when we're sleeping with our Wi-Fi on, like you said, our system doesn't shut down because we can't get into that deep sleep, which is why it's so important to turn your Wi-Fi off at night and to avoid blue light after dark and do everything in your power to stop the chronic stress that's coming in an environmental way, not just in a physical way. And so to that effect, like as far as the stress output with regard to these people that are exercising, they're eating right, they're doing all the right things, but they don't see the results on the scale or in their clothes or in their aesthetics. You know, even I've been researching how it's harder for bodybuilders and physique competitors to get to stage lean now because of the environmental stressors that they're probably not even aware of. But can you talk to that effect? Like there is an avenue of stress even with chronic exercise, with the stress about eating a certain way. I mean, can you talk to some of the detriments of cortisol
Sure.
with regard to that?
So first, I want to kind of change the definition of stress a little bit. Many people think of stress as something that's threatening, right? And you have to be consciously aware of it. That's not really how biologically stress is defined. Stress is anything that causes a reaction from your body that requires mustering up an energetic response, right? In other words, so let's say, if you drink alcohol, right, which burdens your liver, requires processing, etc., etc. So you went out to the bar, had one too many, right? You came home, you're falling asleep, or you're trying to fall asleep. But for most people, they wouldn't think that they're under stress. Yet their body is under profound stress because it's working overtime when it should be recovering to get rid of this chemical in their body, if you take too much of it, that it perceives as a toxin. So in other words, the body has to expend energy in order to get rid of this toxin and get you back to homeostasis, to your normal healthy self. Well, just because you went home and you're no longer at the bar doesn't mean that the effects are not continuing. So I think people need to step back a little bit and start thinking about stress as anything, whether it's an event, whether it's a chemical, whether it's an activity that they do or others do to them, anything that continues long enough to cause the body to basically get into a situation where the body says, I don't have enough energy, I'm going to call on the stress system. And basically, then let the stress system take over. Because again, the purpose of the stress system is when the body needs energy but doesn't get enough from, let's say, stored glycogen in your liver or stored glycogen in your muscles, then once that supply of energy gets exhausted, then the body says, I need more. And unless you're eating, then the only other place this energy can come from is your own body, which gets the stress system starts to disintegrate everything that is non-essential to keeping you alive and starts converting it into energy. So again, stress is anything, whether it's consciously perceived or not, that affects your body to the point where the body perceives that it doesn't have the sufficient energy reserves to take care of it. So if it doesn't, and by sufficient energy reserves, I mean the energy reserves that it gets from food. Because anytime you eat, most people eat, the amount of calories they consume are sufficient not just to keep them alive that very minute, but for a few hours and potentially a few days later. So most of that extra energy gets stored in the body, in the liver, mostly in the liver and muscles, in the form of glycogen. And that's what the body uses initially. That's what it prefers to use when it's faced with a stressful event. Or initially, while you have good energy reserves, the event that's demanding that you to respond, consciously or unconsciously, is not stressful. It's actually could be stimulating, right? If you're well fed and well rested, going out, for a short run or like a relaxing game of like flag football or frisbee or whatnot with friends, that's actually considered stimulating, and most people like it. But try to do the same thing after, let's say, a night of binge drinking and not sleeping well, and then the next morning you get up and then try to go one of these activities and see if you're going to perceive it as stressful or pleasurable. It will be likely the former. And the reason is the former is that now these things, because anything in life requires an energetic response, if you don't have the energy reserves, then now this becomes a stressful event, because the body says, I don't care if frisbee is pleasurable. If it was before. I don't care if flag football was pleasurable. I cannot give you the energy that you need to enjoy these and to basically, because the energy that I prefer to use, the glycogen, is gone. I used it to process that toxin, the alcohol that you ingested the previous night. So guess what? Now I need more of this energy. And if you don't give it to me, then I'm going to call the stress system and say, take over. Yeah. And that's what most people don't realize, that you basically have debit and credit more or less in your body. And if you keep withdrawing, at some point when you start running on negative, whenever you reach into the negative territory, that's the stress system taking over. So the more you stay in the positive one, the less detrimental will be the effects of aging in the world on you. And in fact, it's been shown that people who keep chronic stress down to a minimum tend to live on average between 15 and 20 years longer. That's not a small amount. No. If the average human lifespan is about 84 to 85 years in the United States, 20 years, this is like a quarter, right? So who doesn't want to live 25% more? And that is, it can be done simply by making sure, by being cognizant of the things that put you into the negative, and then, trying to avoid them. Now, speaking of trying to avoid them, there's a danger in that too. In fact, psychiatry has defined an entire set of conditions related to trying to protect yourself too much. One of them is called orthorexia. In other words, being so careful about what you eat that you get to the point of not eating at all simply because you think no food is good enough for you, right? Well, we don't want to get to that point. I mean, there are certain simple rules which you can use that you do the best you can with what's available. You can make better choices and worse choices. I don't think in the current world perfect choices are possible, and that's what people should be cognizant of as well. Because I think some dietary, some nutritional advisors go too far by saying you will only eat these foods and nothing else, right? That's already stressful. If you're at work and let's say the local cafeteria or the local restaurant or the local bar, if they don't have that food and you have to walk 2 miles, knowing that you're still at work, and you have to stress yourself and you have to rush, and you have to get to a point where you're sweating and you're angry and you're exhausted, and you come back to the office with your perfect food in hand, guess what? You will no longer have those benefits that were promised to you by the nutritionist, even if assuming they were there to start with. So the idea is do the best you can with the information you have at hand and with what's in front of you, and don't go into extremes. The body does not like extremes. Any extreme gets you into the negative territory energy-wise and turns on the stress response. So, and the rules are simple, really. I mean, I guess the one of the simplest ways I've heard it being described is eat like your grandmother, like your grandparents. I mean, if when you take a product in the store, you look at the label. If it has more than 5 ingredients, it's probably not worth eating. It's got things there that are not good for you at the very least. They were there to protect and enhance its shelf life, and basically allow it to be sold, almost indefinitely. But usually all of these preservatives, all of these chemicals that are there to prevent other organisms from eating that food, which is what spoiling is. Well, if it's bad for bacteria, if it's bad for fungi, if it's bad for insects, it's probably not good for you either. I mean, we're not that different biologically. So again, eat simple foods that were mostly found on farms, 50 to 100 years ago. Spend time with happy, healthy people, and don't fret too much over trying to protect yourself from every possible evil in the world. There are an uncountable number of them. It is simply not possible for a human to fend them all off. Yeah. It's a matter of taking care of the few, 2 or 3 that are likely to really ruin your health.
Yeah, like it's not hard, like we mentioned, to eat unprocessed foods. I mean, it doesn't have to even be, I mean, even Ray Peat that says that things that say organic, you don't have to stress over that because really there's nothing organic anymore. Everything is going to have spray over from the other field. And you drink water and you exercise to an extent that makes you feel good, not to an over amount. And you turn off your Wi-Fi when you're not using it. And you use blue blockers. These are like little things you can do that take that layer by layer stress off. And I wanted to really commend you, like your credit and debit response about the cortisol kicking in when you don't supply the glycogen, because I think that's partially why there is so much adrenal and cortisol issues right now because of this whole keto low carb movement. So people have added another stressor to their life by going keto or low carb. And that kicks in that credit account where we gotta flip over to cortisol because you're not supplying me any glycogen. So I'll just click over and eventually I'm going to have such a high bill to pay because my stress has added up to a huge amount. So even something as simple as adding in those simple sugars to help yourself always have that glycogen available to the liver. I mean, these are just small things that people can do. You like to talk about reproductive aging, and I know we've touched on it a little bit with the reproductive hormones, but there is so much validity to keeping our sex hormones adequate. And part of that is making sure that we're reducing the stress and cortisol. So can you talk about like a little more about reproductive aging and maybe like how we can stimulate more testosterone and progesterone and all of the important hormone productions?
Sure. I mean, actually, reproductive health and aging isn't that much different from systemic. In other words, you can't really take any system in isolation and say, if this system ages, the rest of the body will be fine. It just doesn't work like that because cells communicate with each other body-wide almost continuously. And every cell in the body more or less knows through chemical signals and electromagnetic signals how every other cell in the body is doing. Cells work as a team. They always work as a team. And usually problems start when a sufficient number of the cells is going deranged under extreme stress, and then the rest of the cells simply don't have enough resources to throw at the stress cells to help them recover. That's what really most of disease in a nutshell is. You've depleted, you've gone, just like you said, you've gone into the credit so much that it's not only you have a high bill to pay, but basically the bank now says, I can't extend you any more credit until you pay your bills. It's just not possible. I don't believe you'll repay them. So until you repay them, no more credit. Well, that's really how it works. The body basically says, I can't keep you healthy anymore. And one of the first things that we can dispense of is looking good, looking young, looking healthy, right? So the body says, if you keep running me into the ground like that, then eventually I'm just going to start compromising certain things for good that I don't, well, not for good, but you'll start seeing degradation simply because I have to borrow this energy from somewhere. And if you're not providing it, and if you're keeping me in the negative, well, I'll take it back from you. Think of it as repossession. Think of it as foreclosure. Body says, if you keep me stressed, I will foreclose your skin. If you keep me stressed, I will foreclose your muscles. I will foreclose your reproductive health, your brain health. And because reproductive health is considered a non-essential function, it's one of the first things to go. It's not a coincidence that people that are under stress, significant amount of stress, they're very often infertile. In fact, there is a special medical term. It's actually a medical disease. FDA recognizes the disease. It's called the female athlete triad, and it's characterized by high prolactin, high estrogen, and lack of a period. So these women, basically, many of them are highly competitive athletes. And then let's say they finish their career, and they say, or during their career, they say, oh, I want to become a mother, right? I want to try for a baby, and it doesn't happen. Then they go to the doctor. The doctor says, look, if you don't have a period, this means reproductive system is shut down. We can try certain things, but if you want to do it naturally, if you want to be an actual mother, and give birth, this has to stop. I mean, the stress has to stop, or you cannot conceive. And instead of taking that advice to heart and saying, okay, maybe I overexerted myself, maybe I pushed myself too much. Many women think that, well, it's not that big of a deal. They can still extract eggs from the ovaries, and then they can do an in vitro fertilization, right? and then they can actually, you can even use a surrogate mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because many of these women that are in the female athlete triad condition, even if they get a successfully fertilized egg from their partner, and then they get it implanted back into them, they can keep the baby. The baby, keeping the baby requires an even more energetic expenditure, right? So if you're already that much in the red, then you don't have that energy, and the direct cause is deficiency of progesterone. So I don't know if you've noticed the tendency, but a large number of celebrities who are in a really poor health, most of them, have actually foregone giving birth altogether. They're now using almost exclusively surrogate mothers. And for some of them, you wouldn't even believe it by looking at them, because you will think that, oh my God, these people are multimillionaires. They're the spitting image of health, or at least they're telling us they are. How is it possible that they can't have a baby? Well, Kim Kardashian is one example. I think January Jones, the actress, recently said was another one. Demi Moore is another one. So all of these highly successful, highly educated, smart women end up in a situation where, because they push themselves too much, then they choose the option of saying, well, recovering will be it will take too long. It'll take too much of an effort, too much of a time. Clearly they have the money, but it's too much effort, too much time. I'm just not going to bother. I'll continue with what I have right now, and my reproductive health will be effectively outsourced. That's really the word. It's the outsourcing of this vital function. Guess what? You can outsource the production of a baby, and it sounds terrible, but you can't outsource your health. If your reproductive system health is in the drain, then that speaks volumes about the rest of your health, about your systemic health. So yeah, you may get the baby through, via different means, but if you don't fix your health, if you don't restore the energetic balance, you will still pay the price sooner or later. The body will still start foreclosing on you one way or another, and there's no escaping that. You can't outsource your body to somebody else. I know many people want to, but it's simply not possible. So for as long as that's the situation, we need to be cognizant of what makes the body age and what makes it not age. So speaking of stress, chronic stress leads to early menopause. Chronic stress leads to infertility in both sexes. Chronic stress leads to early aging, and menopause is one of the prime examples of aging. It's considered aging of the reproductive system, but there are multiple studies going back at least 80 years that have shown an almost perfect correlation between early menopause and early death from any cause, between early menopause and cancer, between early menopause and diabetes, early menopause and neurodegenerative disease. Every possible disease or mortality from any disease or any cause, even accidents, has been tied to early menopause. So we have evidence that this symptom of reproductive health is really a symptom of your overall health in general. And the same thing applies to men. I mean, basically, sperm counts have declined by almost 70% over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
1 in 3 couples, actually, these days, 1 in 3 couples cannot conceive naturally for due to health reasons. Whether it's the female or the male, it doesn't matter. Usually it tends to be equal. It used to be that women will get the stigma if a family can't have a baby, it will be like blamed on the woman. But if you look at the statistics these days, men are just as unhealthy reproductive-wise as women if the couple is infertile. So that's and cortisol plays a huge role in that. Again, your ovaries, your testicles in men. Again, these are amino acid containing tissues. Of course, that if cortisol needs to produce glucose to supply the liver with amino acids, well, it's going to reach and take the tissues first that the body considers the least important for survival. Reproduction is perhaps the one that the body considers least important for survival. Yet it's the most one of the most reliable examples of overall health. So that's what early stress leads to. It's a systemic degenerative condition, and there are studies with humans showing that you can produce every single symptom of aging that we are aware of: wrinkled skin, sagging skin, loss of muscles known as sarcopenia, gaining fat, loss of hair, almost everything we associate with aging, every visible symptom, visible or invisible through biomarkers, it can be produced in a matter of weeks by administering high doses of cortisol. And this can be confirmed in every animal model that is clinically used, and humans as well. So that's what stress does. It ages you, it kills you if it's chronic. And unfortunately, we live under chronic stress almost 24/7. But like I said, there are many simple measures that can be taken to greatly limit the effect of that stress. Endocrine disruptors is another thing I wanted to touch upon, because they greatly affect both reproductive health and general health as well. There are these chemicals in plastics that have been shown to be able to act like steroid hormones. They actually are capable of acting like estrogen in the body, like cortisol, and also to block the effects of thyroid. So you're kind of getting the worst of all worlds through these chemicals that are leaching from the plastics all around us. And companies, for-profit companies, love plastics. They're cheap to produce. They never spoil. They never degrade, which should already tell you that, you know, how good they are for you. Stuff that doesn't degrade, whether it's food you ingest or any product that's going to somehow end up in your system, is probably something you need to be careful about. So limiting the usage of plastics, especially heating things in plastics, because that's what accelerates the leaching of these dangerous chemicals, is very, very important for systemic and reproductive health. These endocrine disruptors, if they act like estrogen and cortisol, but they block thyroid, they can directly lead to infertility. It has been shown, there are a number of studies that looked at the sperm count of males, and there was almost a perfect inverse relationship between the level of these endocrine disruptors, these endocrine polluters, and then the sperm count in the fertility of males. In other words, the more of these microparticles men had inside of their bodies, the less fertile they were. And beyond a certain level, they were basically infertile, even if their testosterone levels were in the normal range. But for most of them, these endocrine disruptors affected even testosterone levels. So it wasn't just infertility. Testosterone is important, a very important hormone that makes men look male, right? So many of the modern males, and I'm sure many people have noticed this phenomena, they look feminized. It doesn't have to get to the point where they grow breasts, right? But many of them these days basically have trouble growing facial hair. Musculature is not well developed. They're hunched over. Some of them are either very, very skinny or very, very overweight. All of these things are signs of an endocrine imbalance, which is ultimately driven by a combination of stress and these endocrine disruptors that are all around us, the Wi-Fi. So ultimately, these are all stressors. So ultimately, stress, whether it's a perceived event or something unconscious that's acting upon us all the time, leads to disease, to early aging, to degeneration, and ultimately premature death.
Yeah, and it's those layers that we can peel away, just like you were mentioning. One easy fix is avoiding BPA plastic or BPS plastic, because now they have the BPA-free and they've switched to BPS, which is no different basically. So just don't use plastics. But that's just one small thing that people...
Even more dangerous. The BPS actually is even more dangerous because it was shown to bind to these steroid receptors even more strongly than BPA. So that's what the industry does when it perceives a problem that things will affect profits, then they replace it, right? But it doesn't mean they replaced it with something good. All they have to do by law is comply with a request or a lawsuit that says remove chemical X. Usually the court decision doesn't say not only remove chemical X, but make your product healthy, because that's considered too generic. Usually the decision is just remove this toxin, right? They say no problem, the owner will do it. But there's no promise of what we're going to replace it with. And of course, in this case, they replaced it with something much worse. So speaking of restoring reproductive health, aside from avoiding stress, I mean, people can use some of these youth steroids, the pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA. The cortisol is one example. Stressinone, our product, is another example. And we came up with another product for people that don't want to use steroids. We call it Gonadin because of basically the glands that are in the male and the female that are responsible for reproductive function are called the gonads, right? The gonads in the females are the ovaries, and the gonads in the males are the testicles. So it contains 4 ingredients, and we basically found out through a number of different studies that each one of these ingredients has an effect on stimulating your own glands to produce these youthful steroids, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically a known. So you're ingesting a chemical that's found in nature. All of these four ingredients are natural. They're found in nature, and they basically, instead of you ingesting preformed hormones like progesterone and DHEA, many people either don't want to do that, their doctor is against it. There may be a number of different reasons. But if you don't want to go throughout the hormonal route, then we have a non-hormonal, and all of these are dietary ingredients that are found in smaller quantities in a number of different foods: olive oils, vegetables, basically honey, a number of different ingredients in honey like bee pollen, like royal jelly. The four chemicals that are in our product Gonadin are contained in smaller amounts in these natural foods. Mm-hmm. So all we did is extract them, get them in an isolated form, and combine them in a dosage that has been shown in studies to increase the progesterone synthesis in females and the testosterone synthesis in male.
Yes, that I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was actually going to ask about that. But yeah, there are people that, maybe they've gotten their DHEA tested and their DHEA is fine, but some other hormone is off, and maybe they are, like you said, hesitant about using any sort of supplement. But yeah, it is good to get the levels tested too and know where you're at, and get a complete hormone panel and know where you're at. But I think based on what we talked about today, I think just some action steps are, find out your levels, lower that stress response any way you can, see how many layers you're dealing with on a weekly basis, and see where you can knock some of those stressors out. Just like we mentioned with the plastics and the Wi-Fi and the eating unprocessed foods, and making sure that you have adequate sugars coming in so that you're not just low carb in it all the time. And then look and see, is there a supplement that I could boost my own natural production? Is there a hormone that would benefit me? Is there a multi-minerals that I'm missing, zinc and magnesium, that would also help with hormone production, as well as vitamin D, getting your sunlight, getting a vitamin D supplement if you can't get enough sun. And that way, these are all ways that cortisol will get lower, the reproductive aging will stop, and you'll kind of anti-age over time, like you were mentioning with that DHEA product. So yeah, so we're excited to hear about that. But I think that's really where the steps lie, those action steps lie for people to start to lower that cortisol, because life will get better when they start to do that. Your health will improve. So
yeah, it's miraculous how resilient the body is if we just give it the right tools and remove the things that are detrimental. You don't have to remove all of them, but the primary ones are the stressor. And I wanted to mention, like, one of the simplest tests where you can tell where you're under stress is cholesterol levels. I know that doctors usually speak about cholesterol in regards to heart disease, but it's actually, that theory is also crumbling lately. But what cholesterol shows you is that since cholesterol is the precursor to all of the other steroids, right? When cholesterol levels rise, that's an indication that cholesterol is not getting converted into pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, testosterone. And the reason is, recent studies have found that some of the most potent inhibitors of the conversion of cholesterol into the downstream hormones is cortisol, estrogen, endocrine disruptors, Wi-Fi, blue light. All of these things effectively are stressor and have the effect of your body's ability to convert cholesterol into the things that the body needs. So if you go to the doctor and you test your cholesterol and your cholesterol comes back high, aside from what the doctor tells you about cardiovascular disease, it is a very reliable biomarker of stress, simply of stress. Conversely, if you make some of these changes and you start seeing that your cholesterol levels start to drop into the normal range, not too low, right? That's actually a pretty good indication that you're on the right track. And it's pretty cheap. Most insurance companies cover the cholesterol test because of the link to cardiovascular disease, the presumed link. I don't think it's there, but so it's a simple test. Anybody can do it. In fact, they even have machines that can take they do just a finger prick, and with a single drop of blood, you can get it done. I think Walgreens used to have some of these machines. They may still have them. I think Rite Aid, they have them in certain locations. So you don't even need to go to the doctor. You can get a so-called field cholesterol test, and you can do this periodically. Once a month is perfectly fine. You have to prick yourself 10 times a day like a diabetic person will do, that's already another stress, right? So don't go in overboard.
Yeah.
Once a month is fine. It just it'll give you like a nice little trend of how you're doing stress-wise. And I think cholesterol and vitamin D, but even only cholesterol are basically good enough. And if you go to the doctor, just like you said, then you can ask for the full hormonal panel. That will definitely help. But most doctors refuse to do it more than once a year. Insurance is one reason, but most doctors don't want to really mess with hormones. And if they test it, they'll test it once a year as part of your physical. The rest of the time, you can supplement by testing your own cholesterol.
Yeah, and there's a website, healthlabs.com, and other ones that are similar to that where you can order your own little test. You don't need a doctor. You just order, you pay for it online, so it's out of pocket. But then you just go to your local LabCorp or Quest Labs and get your blood drawn, and you can get it within 24 hours or 48 hours. So yeah, that's a really easy fix. And Georgie, just talking to you lowers my stress response. So I had a lot of fun today talking with you. And this is so much needed information. So I'm so glad you're doing the studies that you are. I'm so glad you have the products that you do. And I hope people will really benefit from what you're putting out there. And I encourage everyone to support what you're doing. And they can do that and benefit themselves just by getting some Cortisol and some Gonadin and giving it a try. I know with my own personal experience with Cortisol, when I had still recovering from the toxic mold, one bottle of that and I noticed a difference, and I noticed how it helped the stress response from the toxic mold come down quite a bit. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll wrap it up. Any last words? Let them know where your website is and how they can find you.
Yeah, I have a Twitter account where I post, basically it's little snippets. I also have a blog. The Twitter account is twitter.com/Haydut, which is my online moniker, my online alias, spelled H is in Harry, A-I-D is in dog, U-T. And then basically I have a blog, which is haydut.me, M-E.
Yes.
So the Twitter and the blog communicate with each other. One or the other is usually enough, but the Twitter has just the little quick snippets. The blog has the full articles, and also post on the repeatforum.com, one word, repeatforum.com. Those are the places where people can find my work. And we have a website, a company website where we sell products, idealabsdc.com. But you don't have to remember it. You go to my Twitter account or my blog account, and you can find the corporate website from there.
And I'll have the links down below too. So
that's pretty much it. Yeah, keep fun up and stress down, but don't go overboard. Don't go overboard on both. Either one can become a stressor if done too much.
And focus on love, because anytime you think the word love or love someone in your life or display love, you're going to lower that stress response too. So.
I want to finish with speaking of love, there's a quote from an Arabian poet.
Okay.
It says that the destiny of a man is creating, and that there are many forms of creating, but love is the best form of creating, and everything else is a form of waiting.
Oh, I love that. Okay, you might have to email me that so I can put that down below too. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Georgie. This has been fun, and we'll do it again soon. You guys stay tuned for more, and you can post your questions below. Maybe sometime we could do a listener Q&A too, and just see what questions they have about certain hormones and body systems, products, and stuff like that. So
absolutely. Yeah, we'll be glad to. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and bye for now.
Thank you.
What's up, YouTube followers? Just a quick promo code for you of my show sponsor, dropandfbomb.com. You can get healthy oil packets like coconut oil, MCT oil, and their little pork sticks, salt and pepper pork sticks, no hormones, no nitrates, no artificial anything. Just really great ingredients that are quick and easy and on the go. Use my code GETFIT, GETFIT, to save 10%. And go to dropandfbomb.com today to get your packets of on-the-go convenient foods, healthy convenient foods. And it's a healthy way to drop an F-bomb today.